Sometimes people become so emotionally attached to their suffering that they no longer know who they are without it. What once started as pain slowly becomes identity. The mind keeps replaying disappointment, loneliness, rejection, failure, and emotional wounds until eventually sadness stops feeling temporary and starts feeling familiar. And after a while, many people do not even realize they are no longer only experiencing pain anymore. They are emotionally living inside it every single day. Maybe lately, you have noticed how easy it is to fall back into the same emotional patterns over and over again, replaying everything that hurt you, thinking about how unfair life felt, remembering the people who damaged you, ignored you, abandoned you, or made you feel emotionally invisible for too long. And little by little, the mind begins building an emotional identity around suffering itself, almost as if pain becomes the only part of you that still feels real anymore. The dangerous part about self-pity is that it rarely feels dangerous in the beginning. At first, it feels understandable, human, even comforting sometimes. Because when people feel emotionally exhausted for too long, suffering can slowly become a place of emotional familiarity. And the mind often chooses familiar pain over unfamiliar healing, because at least suffering feels emotionally predictable. You already know how disappointment feels. You already know loneliness. You already know emotional exhaustion. But healing feels uncertain, vulnerable, and unfamiliar, which quietly makes many people afraid of it without realizing. And honestly, most people who are trapped in self-pity are not weak people. Very often, they are emotionally overwhelmed, people who carried pain alone for too long, without enough support, understanding, or emotional safety. Over time, the mind begins protecting itself by constantly revisiting its own suffering, because pain becomes proof that your experiences mattered. Proof that you were hurt. Proof that what happened to you was real. But eventually, constantly reconnecting to old emotional wounds starts preventing you from reconnecting to life itself. Some people become so emotionally identified with being broken that healing almost starts feeling threatening to them. Because if suffering disappears, then they are forced to confront something deeply uncomfortable, the possibility of rebuilding themselves again. And rebuilding requires uncertainty. It requires responsibility. It requires letting go of the emotional identity the mind has been attached to for years. That is why some people unconsciously continue feeding their own sadness, reopening emotional wounds repeatedly, and staying trapped inside cycles of emotional victimhood without fully understanding why they cannot move forward. And social media quietly makes this even worse sometimes. People constantly surround themselves with emotional content that reinforces hopelessness, loneliness, heartbreak, and despair until sadness itself slowly becomes romanticized. The mind starts believing emotional suffering is depth, that being emotionally broken somehow makes you more understood, more special, or more emotionally real than healing does. But there is a difference between acknowledging pain and emotionally building your entire identity around remaining wounded forever. Because eventually, self-pity begins stealing energy from every part of life. You stop trusting yourself. You stop believing change is possible. Opportunities feel pointless before they even begin. Relationships become emotionally heavier. And over time, the mind becomes so focused on what was lost, unfair, or painful that it slowly loses the ability to recognize what is still possible in the present moment. But healing does not begin by pretending your pain never existed. Real healing begins when you finally stop using suffering as the only way to understand yourself. When you stop reopening emotional wounds every day, just to remind yourself that you were hurt. Because pain may explain part of your story, but it was never supposed to become your permanent identity. And maybe one of the hardest parts about healing is accepting that life will not suddenly give you closure for everything that happened. Some people will never apologize. Some wounds will never fully make sense. Some experiences will always remain emotionally painful to remember. But constantly reliving your suffering does not protect you from pain anymore. It only keeps your mind emotionally trapped inside it. The truth is, healing feels uncomfortable at first because pain has been emotionally familiar for too long. But surviving is not the same thing as living. And maybe your life truly begins the moment you finally stop asking your suffering to tell you who you are. Because you are more than the pain that happened to you. Even if part of your mind still struggles to believe that sometimes.